Is this better? Let's see. I think it's gone from one extreme to the other, but we're going to get started if you can hear me. Okay? All right. On September 14th, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky walked into what can only be described as hell on earth. It was just days after Ukrainian forces recaptured the city of Izium, and President Zelensky wanted to assess the damage personally. The once picturesque riverside city was now unrecognizable. Mass graves were filled with hundreds of unidentified bodies, including children. Bodies with crushed skulls, victims' hands tied behind their backs, faces mutilated beyond recognition, many showing signs of torture. It was the same sickening scene we saw in Bucha and in other towns that have been so-called liberated from Russian forces. We must not look away. We must face this squarely. We must bear witness to these heinous acts, which is why we have images of these crimes around the hearing room today. I met with Ukrainian Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin last week. He told me the Ukrainians have documented nearly 35,000 war crimes like the ones you see in these images since Russia's illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. As Russia escalates its war, the free nations of the world cannot sit back. We must uphold our nation's legacy from Nuremberg, where the United States led the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, by bringing today's perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity to justice. I'd like to turn to a video on the importance of that legacy.
I am heartbroken to see it happening again. Kids being shot, homes being blown up. It pains me to see that we have learned so little from the Holocaust.
I have one word to describe, and it's just hell. It was just going to recover dead bodies of our friends.
Для батька. Я їй сказав, що нас розстріляли, і батька вже нема.
He tells me how an SS officer nearly killed him in 1941, and now he's survived a Russian onslaught 8 decades later.
Human beings buried in unmarked graves. 99% were killed by violence, and some of the bodies show signs of torture. We met a woman who had to witness the exhumation of her own son, who'd been tortured and murdered by Russian soldiers. We visited a room right there that Russian occupiers used for torture, and now that mass burial site that we see there in Izium.
As for now, more civilians than soldiers. Wherever Russian army steps in, they turn everything into Bucha.
We have all been seeing the pictures and reading the reports regarding the devastation, the human cost to civilians, men, women and children. Nobody is above the law, nobody's beneath it.
Ukraine is today a slaughterhouse.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
When the Nuremberg trials first convened in 1945, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson was the chief prosecutor. He recognized that the best corrective to the brutish lawlessness of the Nazis was the rule of law. He deemed the trials, quote, one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Those words echoed through history last week when President Zelensky called on the world's leaders to ensure that the perpetrators of atrocities in Ukraine can find no safe haven anywhere in the world. We must continue to support Ukraine's efforts to prosecute war criminals, and we must support the International Criminal Court's investigation of atrocities in Ukraine. But it's also up to this body to ensure that our laws here at home do not enable this terrible deed. More than a decade ago, I had the honor of chairing the Senate's first ever Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law. Last year, as chair of the Judiciary Committee, I was pleased to reconstitute this subcommittee, now chaired by Senator Feinstein. Over the years, we had a number of bipartisan accomplishments, including the Genocide Accountability Act, which granted the Justice Department power to prosecute war criminals on American soil who had participated in genocide. The Child Soldiers Accountability Act, which made it illegal under U.S. law to recruit or use child soldiers. But our work is far from finished. A number of shameful loopholes in America's laws continue to enable war criminals and perpetrators of crimes against humanity to find safe haven in the United States. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? But in 2006, Marko Baskic, a man who participated in the Srebrenica genocide in Bosnia, was discovered living in Massachusetts. Rather than charging him with crimes against humanity, our government charged Baskic with visa fraud. Why? Because our nation still, to this day, does not have a law in the books prohibiting crimes against humanity. Do you want to risk reading a headline 10 years from now about a Russian who murdered civilians in Ukraine enjoying impunity in America? I certainly don't. That's why I've introduced the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act with my ranking member, Senator Grassley, as co-sponsor. This bill has been co-sponsored as well by Senators Leahy, Graham, Coons, and Blunt, and will close a loophole in the War Crimes Act so that foreign war criminals present in our country can be prosecuted even if they're discovered here years after the crimes. I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this bill and enact a bipartisan crimes against humanity statute as well. Before turning to Senator Grassley, I might say that after the meeting with the Prosecutor General from Ukraine last week, a bipartisan group, Senator Portman, who co-chairs the Ukraine caucus with me, Senator Graham, Jean Shaheen, and Senator Ossoff, are joining in an effort to see the best approach to dealing with these war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. It is an active effort. It has involved follow-on meetings and will continue to. I'll now turn to Ranking Member Grassley for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for this very important hearing, and thank you for the bipartisan approach on this issue. Since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, that's beginning in February, as we know, we've all been horrified by the reports of war crimes committed by Russian forces. We've heard of mass graves, torture, sexual assault, the bombing of a mall crowded with civilians, and even an attack on a maternity hospital. Ukraine has begun to successfully prosecute some war crimes, and I hope many more perpetrators will be brought to justice. We know from our experience with Nazi war criminals that some offenders will escape immediate prosecution. They may assume false names. They may flee to other countries. Some may even successfully make it to our country. When these war criminals get into the United States, they can't be allowed to live freely in our country. We have to have options to exclude, extradite, and punish war criminals. We must enhance our immigration laws and ensure it's as difficult as possible for individuals who engage in human rights violations to enter, and if they enter, remain in the United States. That's why I and Senator Graham introduced a bill that we entitled Human Rights Violation Act of 2022. We did that earlier this year. The bill would formally authorize ICE's Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center, which has done great work to ensure that the United States doesn't become a refuge for these and those who engage in war crimes and human rights violations. It also updates our immigration laws to include specific grounds of inadmissibility and deportability for persecutors and war criminals. and to better take account of non-state groups that engage in extrajudicial killings. Since cases against human rights violators are often built on criminal statutes related only to fraud, perjury, and false statements, it would also increase the statute of limitations to 20 years in cases of fraud, perjury, and misrepresentation that involve human rights violation. Finally, it would give the USCIS full access to criminal history records and authorize the Department of Homeland Security to assess fees to fund the visa security and national security programs within that department. I'm proud of this bill and think it's a step in the right direction to ensure that this country is never a safe haven for war criminals and human rights violators. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee and in the Senate as a whole to advance this legislation. But we also have to have a prosecution option. We can work with Ukraine to send war criminals back for trial where they committed their crimes, but there will be times, perhaps other conflicts, where no other authority will be available to prosecute. With Senators Durbin, Graham, Leahy, Blunt, Coons, I've introduced the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act. This bipartisan bill narrowly expands the jurisdiction of the existing war crimes statute. It ensures that we have a prosecution option when foreign war criminals are present in our territory. This type of jurisdiction already exists for many statutes, including many terrorism statutes. I understand that the Department of Defense would like to see this expansion because it fulfills our obligations under the Geneva Conventions. It ensures that there is no safe haven for any war criminal. I hope we'll work together to ensure this fix becomes law. I thank all the witnesses for hearing today and look forward to our dialogue.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. We welcome two witnesses from the executive branch who will testify about gaps in our laws in America for holding perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity who come to our shores accountable. Our first witness is Eli Rosenbaum from the Department of Justice. Mr. Rosenbaum is the Director of Human Rights Enforcement Strategy and Policy in the Criminal Division's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section. As a point of personal privilege, I was pleased to author the Human Rights Enforcement Act of 2009, bipartisan legislation which established the office that Mr. Rosenbaum leads. Attorney General Garland recently named Mr. Rosenbaum to serve as Counselor for War Crimes Accountability. In this capacity, he coordinates the department's efforts to hold accountable those responsible for war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. Our second witness is Andre Watson, the Assistant Director for National Security at Homeland Security Investigations, the principal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security. HSI investigates a wide array of transnational crimes, including human rights violations. We are going to proceed by having the witnesses with 5-minute opening statements and then turn to the members who will each have 5 minutes to ask questions as well. So first, will the witnesses please stand to be sworn in? Raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Mr. Rosenbaum, please proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for inviting the Department of Justice to address gaps in federal law that significantly limit our ability to bring war criminals and perpetrators of human rights crimes to justice. Given the shocking crimes being perpetrated by Russia during its unprovoked war against Ukraine, this hearing could not possibly be held at a more appropriate, urgent, or frankly, terrifying time. The Justice Department is committed to holding the perpetrators of such grave crimes fully accountable. During a trip to Ukraine in June, Attorney General Garland announced the creation of the department's War Crimes Accountability Team to centralize and strengthen our Ukraine accountability efforts, and he asked me to lead it. Unfortunately, however, the Title 18 War Crimes Statute does not cover the vast majority of war criminals who have come to the United States, who are here, or who will eventually come here, because it confers jurisdiction only when a victim or perpetrator is a U.S. person, not on the basis that the perpetrator has immigrated to this country or is otherwise on U.S. soil. The statute also contains other provisions that limit our ability to enforce it. Having prosecuted World War II Nazi cases for nearly 4 decades, I can attest to the deep frustration we experienced because statutory limitations like those made it impossible to criminally prosecute any of the many Nazi criminals we found here. Instead, we could bring only civil actions against them. Russian and other war criminals who come here should not be able similarly to escape criminal justice or even find safe haven here. There's a second major gap. The federal torture statute doesn't confer jurisdiction based on the victim's U.S. nationality. Thus, even if a civilian U.S. citizen or a U.S. military service member becomes a victim of torture abroad under color of law, the U.S. ordinarily has no jurisdiction to prosecute unless the perpetrator is a U.S. citizen or is subsequently present here. And there's a third major gap. We don't have a statute criminalizing crimes against humanity. Such laws, the first of which the United States famously co-prosecuted at the post-World War II Nuremberg trials, allow for the prosecution of certain criminal acts, such as enslavement or mass murder, when committed as part of a systematic or widespread attack against a civilian population, even if those attacks occur outside the context of an armed conflict or a genocide. War crimes and genocide statutes alone simply are not sufficient to address the full and tragic array of large-scale atrocity crimes that continue to beset the world. I would be pleased to provide examples of infamous and horrific crimes that are beyond federal prosecutors' reach in the absence of a Crimes Against Humanity statute. The Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, State, and Justice, among other agencies, have agreed on technical solutions that would fill all 3 gaps that I've just mentioned. If those gaps are filled, the Justice Department can play, and is eager to play, a much fuller role in the crucial effort to make the post-Holocaust imperative never again a reality, not just an endlessly unrealized aspiration. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for affording me the opportunity to testify here today, and I would be pleased to respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenbaum. Mr. Watson?
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I am pleased to have the opportunity to address this committee today on the critical role U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, continues to play in ensuring that the United States does not become a safe haven for human rights violators, and to highlight areas in which legislation would assist us in more effectively pursuing criminal investigations and prosecutions. I am also honored to testify alongside our Department of Justice DOJ partner, Mr. Eli Rosenbaum, who has dedicated his life's mission to seek justice for thousands of individuals who have been persecuted under the unscrupulous hands of perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The collaboration between the Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center, the Center, and DOJ, as well as the Departments of State and Defense and our other center partners, is a testament that the United States will not tolerate or condone perpetrators of atrocities against mankind to seek refuge and safe haven from their heinous crimes. One of the primary ways HSI accomplishes and leads this mission is through robust engagement at the Center. The Center, which ICE established in 2008, has not been codified. Codification of the Center would solidify the United States' standing as a leader in identifying and prosecuting human rights violators and memorialize the U.S. government's commitment to ensuring that the United States does not become a safe haven for those who commit these heinous atrocities. The Center focuses on its mission in two ways. One, by identifying, investigating, prosecuting, and removing human rights violators and war criminals found within the jurisdiction of the United States. And two, by preventing entry into the United States of known or suspected human rights violators and war criminals. Our ability to accomplish this mission is directly related to our statutory authorities. Despite lengthy and detailed investigations establishing crimes have been committed, at times the U.S. government must forego criminal charges because evidence of the offender's actions did not surface within the statute of limitation. Other times, there are neither criminal nor administrative statutes which address the heinous actions committed, such as those acts which constitute crimes against humanity. Congress can greatly enhance our ability to pursue these cases by enacting targeted legislation. The Center also works with foreign law enforcement and international partners and tribunals to further global accountability. The Center brings together special agents, criminal research specialists, attorneys, and historians with expertise in specific regional areas and conflicts. These team members, joined by our Center partners, are organized into regional support teams that cover the geographic areas of the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. By pursuing accountability for past atrocities, the Center contributes to the urgent work of preventing future atrocities. In addition to our global Magnitsky team, the Center's specialized investigative support teams, those that are not limited to a specific geographic area, is the Female Genital Mutilation Cutting Team, FGMC. FGMC is a form of human rights abuse, a form of gender-based violence, and when performed on children, a form of child abuse. We thank Congress for its leadership in passing the Stop FGM Act that tighten loopholes in the existing statute, and we urge you to enact a comparable provision within the Immigration and Nationality Act so that those who perform FGMC against a minor are ineligible for immigration benefits. HSI is committed to its mission and the role it and the Center plays in broader efforts for accountability. HSI currently has more than 160 active human rights investigations and is handling more than 1,750 human rights-related leads involving suspects from approximately 95 countries, primarily in Central and South America, the Balkans, and Africa. Since 2003, HSI has arrested more than 480 individuals for human rights-related violations under various criminal and/or immigration statutes. The Center strives to fulfill its mission, but would benefit from additional statutory authorities. Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley, I applaud your continued leadership on these important issues. Thank you again for the opportunity to address this committee, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Mr. Watson. Mr. Rosenbaum, let me start with you. The prosecutor from Ukraine made it clear that they are prosecuting Russian individuals in the domestic courts of that country for war crimes. In fact, they have successfully prosecuted some already. They are still looking for an international venue for a court that goes beyond what they can prosecute in Ukraine. Is that our position, or you believe should be our position in the United States, that both are necessary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We at the Department of Justice welcome ongoing discussions about possibilities for international tribunals being constituted to address these horrible crimes, crimes of the kind that we saw in the video that you screened and in these heartbreaking images around the room. We know from experience at Nuremberg and more recent experiences in The Hague involving the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that was in Arusha, Tanzania, and other such efforts that these kinds of modalities of addressing such crimes can be very effective. But as always, it's the details that matter, and again, we welcome exploration of those possibilities.
It would seem to me that in light of the unpopular conscription effort by Putin at the present time, it's important that the United States and other nations who oppose Putin's aggression make it clear that there will be accountability, even for untrained soldiers being handed guns and sent into combat. Do you think this is an important moment to make that point clear?
We at the Department of Justice certainly agree that every opportunity that exists to send the message of deterrence ought to be seized upon, and we have been doing that. The Attorney General has said publicly in Ukraine and elsewhere that there will be no hiding place for war criminals. That's our goal, and that we will be relentless with our partners in Ukraine and elsewhere in pursuing accountability. In particular, a message that a number of us have tried to send to the Russian side, so to speak, is if you are daring to consider obeying a criminal order, you should worry that there might be an American in your line of sight. And that could be, that would include a dual citizen, because then we may have jurisdiction, and we have a long memory here in the United States.
I was asked in the hall, does that mean Vladimir Putin could be found guilty? I said, depending on the evidence and facts and the law, yes. Do you agree?
I'm not going to speculate on individual cases. You know, at the Department of Justice, we have prosecutorial standards set out in the Justice Manual regarding the availability of sufficient admissible evidence to probably win a conviction in court, and we're supposed to consider alternatives, including other venues for possible trial. So I can't speculate on individual cases, but there is rampant criminality and lots of responsibility to go around.
Let me ask you, Mr. Watson, we have evidence that the Department of Homeland Security is currently pursuing more than 1,700 leads of perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity and other human rights violations from approximately 75 different countries. 1,700 leads of people who are living right here in the United States. These are the known leads. The actual number may be just even higher. When the Department of Homeland Security discovers a perpetrator here in the United States, what options does it have for ensuring that that perpetrator will not enjoy safe haven status in our country?
We have numerous options available that will begin with our Human Rights Violators and Coordination Center. So our investigative support teams, as well as our human rights targeting tracking teams, will commence research through open source as well as databases and sometimes classified holdings to develop a crime pattern as it relates to a region, and then from there, people that are associated with those crime patterns. After those folks are identified, we then work to prepare a package, an investigative referral that can be then sent to HSI field offices for coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office or the ICE Office of the Principal Legal Advisor to confirm if there are criminal options available on the table, and if there are no criminal options on the table, then to explore the possibility of administrative options that may be available to facilitate that person's apprehension.
But let me get,
ultimately
Mr. Watson, I'm out of time. I want to ask this one question. If you have 1,700 leads, why have we not heard of more prosecutions? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, the investigations take time because more often than not, it requires an extensive workup. Most of these events occur over a period of time, and the challenge is that, one, we have to identify and locate witnesses, and sometimes those witnesses are OCONUS, outside of the United States. So we'll have our regional support teams and field agents that will need to travel, conduct interviews, gather evidence, and then from there present that evidentiary material and/or witness findings to an assistant United States attorney for determination as to whether or not criminal charges are viable. With that being said, that sometimes can be the delay in one, conducting the investigations, and/or two, initiating appropriate administrative proceedings.
I would just close by saying our credibility on this issue depends on results. Thank you. Senator Grassley?
Yeah. Thanks to both of you for your testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Watson. Senator Graham and I have introduced the Human Rights Violators Act, which, among other things, would formally authorize the center and the appointment of a director for the center. And I know you covered some of this in your written statement, but for those who may not be familiar, could you briefly, and I emphasize briefly because I got some longer questions for you to answer, explain what the center does, in particular use the Operation No Safe Haven as an example?
Yes, sir. So to begin, the center in its operations has investigative support teams, regional support teams, as well as the Human Rights Target Tracking Team. And they all work amongst interagency partners in, one, vetting and validating leads, receiving tips, and then forwarding investigative leads and referral for ongoing investigations. So the center is robust with over 77 members that support ongoing human rights violators and war crimes cases. So that level of effort continues with great success. And we believe that if the center were codified, it would institutionalize interagency relationships and also send a message to the international community that the United States government affirms its position as the United States will not be a safe haven for human rights violators and war criminals.
I think you just answered my next question, Mr. Watson, the importance to formalize and authorize a center. So let me go on. Could you explain why the work of the center is so important in ensuring that human rights violators from around the world don't find a safe haven in the United States?
The work of the center is important because with any conflict that occurs across the globe, victims come to the United States. They're seeking an opportunity to be free from the perpetrators of crimes against humanity and/or war crimes. With that being said, sometimes the perpetrators will follow, and they also can come to the United States by way of fraud or false pretense. So the work of the center in, one, leveraging our regional support teams, as well as our partnerships across the interagency, the international community, as well as NGOs and academia, are critical, one, to keeping track as to events and conflicts that are occurring across the globe, unintended as well as consequences that present themselves, and then what the appropriate response will be in coordination with our interagency and international partners.
Before I go to Mr. Rosenbaum, I know that you also mentioned the importance of taking action on FGM. I just wanted to flag that my bill addresses that issue as well. Mr. Rosenbaum, I lead a bipartisan bill with Chairman Durman and former Chairmans Graham and Leahy, as well as others, to ensure that we have jurisdiction to prosecute foreign war criminals who hide here. Often the United States will have the option to extradite someone who commits war crimes in a foreign country back to the scene of the crime or to their home country or another country that is willing to try them. Is this always the case, or are there some instances where we need a domestic prosecution option?
Thank you, Senator. We're glad that you and the chairman share the Justice Department's commitment to ensuring that the United States is not a safe haven for the perpetrators of war crimes and other atrocity crimes, and also that we have the tools that we need to bring such persons to justice if they do get into the United States. Extradition is sometimes an option, and the Department of Justice has pursued that. I think, for example, of the case of Suleiman Mujagic, who was investigated by my section, the Human Rights and Special Prosecution section, along with our partners at HSI and I believe FBI. And we got him indicted with our partners in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of New York for torture. But when his extradition was requested by Bosnia and Herzegovina, we shifted gears, and the department worked hard to facilitate that extradition, and he was, in fact, sent to Bosnia and Herzegovina to stand trial. In general, people should be tried near the scene of the crimes to be judged by the communities they've offended. And in the federal, the Justice Department manual, the possibility of trial in a different forum is something that prosecutors are supposed to consider in every case. But sometimes, for instance, if the government that directed the perpetration of the crimes is still in power, for example, extradition isn't practicable.
Could I have a follow-up? For you, Mr. Rosenbaum, discuss some of the statutes that have successfully used present in jurisdiction.
As you've mentioned, Senator, there are numerous statutes that incorporate present in jurisdiction. There are at least 21 of them, in fact, that Congress has enacted and that are in Title 18, the Federal Criminal Code. Many of them relate to terrorism, and they run the gamut from incidents in airports that interfere with aviation to a multiplicity of, as I think I said, terrorism offenses. And we also have present in jurisdiction under the torture statute and under the genocide statute, as well as the statute criminalizing use or recruitment of child soldiers, which kind of sounds in war crimes as well, and in the female genital mutilation statute. So the absence of present in jurisdiction in the war crime statute is sort of an outlier among the human rights enforcement statutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to read two brief paragraphs and then ask you whether they're true or false. Last week, a team of experts commissioned by the United Nations Human Rights Council to look at human rights violations in Ukraine found that Russia had committed war crimes in Ukraine, including the use of beatings, electric shocks, and forced nudity against detained individuals. The experts have also been investigating alleged executions in Kyiv, Kharkiv, sunny regions of the Ukraine, and other places. In September, as the Ukraine successfully pushed back Russian forces, police investigators and war crimes prosecutors began investigating a recently discovered mass burial site in the city of Izium. 450 bodies were discovered at the burial site. The vast majority were civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. According to investigators, some of the bodies show signs of torture. The department has confirmed that during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there have been multiple credible reports of Russian forces launching indiscriminate attacks in the city of Mariupol that hit a theater clearly marked to indicate it was civilian. The strike killed 300. So, the question is, we now know what is going on. The question here is, what are we going to do about it? And so I would like to ask that question in an unvarnished way. What is the administration going to suggest that we do about this, or mandate that we do about this?
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I can't speak for the entire administration. I can't speak for the Department of Justice. I think It's a matter of public record that, however, that the United States is supplying extensive military, security, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine as the courageous people of that country fight for their freedom and for the rule of law. On the law enforcement side, our War Crimes Accountability Team calls on the expertise of men and women throughout the Justice Department, and we work with other agencies, including the State Department and Homeland Security. We are providing extensive assistance to the Office of the Prosecutor General in Kyiv. Just 1 week ago yesterday, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Andriy Kostin, was here in Washington. I think the Chairman mentioned he met with him. And while he was here, he signed a memorandum of understanding with Attorney General Merrick Garland that will supercharge our already robust cooperation with Ukrainian authorities, and that's a two-way street. We assist them in their work, and they are assisting us in our own investigations of potential war crimes where we may have jurisdiction under federal law. But it's important, again, that Russians in the field and in Moscow see that the Department of Justice and the rest of the U.S. government stand solidly beside our partners in Ukraine, including on the law enforcement side. We will, as I mentioned, carry out the Attorney General's charge to us to be relentless.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to hear directly from the White House what is going to be done about this. I've read the materials, and if this country doesn't stand up for this kind of behavior, against this kind of behavior, we really should be ashamed of ourselves. So I'd like to ask for this committee to really, in writing, provide the president with a letter that expresses those feelings more eloquently than I can do right now.
I agree with you, Senator, and if you would like to initiate that letter, let's work together, put it together.
Fine, I'd be happy to.
Okay,
Thank you.
Senator Cornyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly join my colleagues in supporting the many bipartisan efforts that we're discussing today, which will hold Mr. Putin and his cronies accountable for war crimes in Ukraine. And I certainly support the effort to provide additional authorities to the Department of Justice in order to bring those war criminals to justice. One piece of legislation that I'd like to mention is the Ukraine Invasion War Crimes Deterrence and Accountability Act, which will direct the White House to collect and catalog evidence of war crimes past and present so that they can actually be prosecuted in a court. It passed the House in April and now is passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is available as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, and we intend to offer that as an amendment. Mr. Rosenbaum, you noted that if someone guilty of a war crime is yet unproven and not convicted makes their way into the United States, that you lack the authorities to prosecute them. Is that correct?
That is correct, unless the perpetrator or a victim was a U.S. national or a U.S. service member.
And if we were to pass a law like the one that the chairman and the ranking member and others of us have support to provide additional authorities to the United States government under those circumstances, that would only apply to prospective cases, correct? Under the Constitution, you can't pass an ex post facto law.
Well, Senator, as almost always in law, it depends. But an argument can be made that for crimes that are universally condemned, like war crimes, for instance, that it does not offend the Constitution's ex post facto clause to enact a law that confers retroactive or retrospective jurisdiction.
Well, that certainly would be an argument that would be made and would have to be decided by the tribunal. But you said in your written statement and perhaps in your verbal statement, I didn't catch it, that it's highly likely that some perpetrators of war crimes have made their way into the United States, correct?
Yes, I wasn't speaking of Russian perpetrators from the current conflict, but rather war criminals from other conflicts, without doubt.
Of any origin. Are you aware that currently at the U.S.-Mexico border that Border Patrol is encountering people from as many as 150 different countries around the world?
I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, Senator, but that's certainly possible.
But you're aware it's from a variety of different countries.
Yes, sir.
And not just Mexico, not just Central and South America.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask Mr. Watson, are you aware that since January of 2021 that 45,000 Russians have presented themselves at our southern border, mainly at the San Diego sector?
Sir, I am aware of Russian nationals appearing at the southwest border, but that number, no, sir.
Well, according to one newspaper report, quoting a woman by the name of Irene Flores, who has spent the last 17 years selling magazines and newspapers at the San Ysidro port of entry, she said a huge influx of Russians in recent months, which, frankly, given what's happening in Russia and Ukraine now, isn't all that surprising. But she is quoted as saying, "Some cross while running, others hide in the trunks of cars. I've seen some open doors and sneak into cars belonging to strangers. CBP officers try to stop them, but they jump out of their cars and make a run for it." Can the Department of Homeland Security say that with any sort of conviction or knowledge that Russian war criminals have not made their way into the United States, either through the asylum process or as one of these getaways or people who tried to avoid detection?
Sir, in my role and capacity as the Assistant Director for National Security, I can only speak to matters today that relate thereto, and to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of particulars to confirm that fact at this time.
Well, do you know whether when people show up at the border and claim asylum, whether they are vetted for things like war crimes?
Sir, I do know the work of the Human Rights Target Tracking Team, and I do know through open source research as well as database checks and collaboration with our IC partners that we do work to populate and provide reports to help inform DHS components in decision-making as it relates to conferring immigration benefits, as well as the Department of State in granting visa applications and approval thereto.
Well, as a matter of fact, the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security do not know whether Russians have appeared at our border, claimed asylum, but have committed as yet unprosecuted war crimes, which, according to Mr. Rosenbaum, the Department of Justice would have no jurisdiction of if they're here in the United States.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks to both of the witnesses for being here. There are two questions I'd like to ask, and because of time constraints and to give you guys a chance to be able to make a more thoughtful and fulsome response, I will offer them as questions for the record so that you can get something back to me in writing rather than deal with it now. The first question has to do with the scale of the atrocities in Russia. The severity of the cruelty is extreme, but so is the scale of the conduct. And that creates its own demands on the ICC in terms of having to deal with enormous amounts of information, run down thousands of allegations, manage huge arrays of evidence. And it is also a problem, I expect, for Ukraine as it goes about bringing its own claims against Russia for the harm and atrocities committed on its soil by Russian troops. So the question is, what are we doing to support the ICC and the Ukrainians in having the back office resources, the data processing, the evidence collection resources to be able to accomplish these purposes successfully? If a huge civil case, a class action were brought in the United States, the firm bringing the class action on behalf of potentially thousands of plaintiffs would have resources, and there are firms that provide those resources to organize all the preparation and make sure that communications with the plaintiffs and evidence, et cetera, were all gathered. Do you understand that question? And you understand what I'm trying to get at? And you'll get me an answer.
Certainly, Senator. Thank you for
Okay, I've got 2 minutes left, so let me jump to the second question.
Okay.
Mr. Watson, you're clear on what I'm asking for?
Yes, Senator.
How are we helping with the back office support necessary to do what is essentially the biggest class action ever? The second has to do with demoralizing the Ukrainian officer corps, which I think is of strategic value. We hear plentiful accounts of ordinary soldiers being disheartened, miserable, and demoralized. And I think that has an effect on the battlefield in Ukraine. To the extent that we can also demoralize the junior officer corps, I think that will have also an effect on the battlefield. And it seems to me that one way to demoralize the junior officer corps is to start calling out individuals by name who are associated with these acts of atrocity and brutality. And to the extent that you can help us assemble that information and help us make it public, if you agree with that strategy, there is bipartisan interest in trying to bring that forward so that if you are a lieutenant, a major, a colonel in Ukraine right now, and you are asked to engage in brutal and likely criminal activity, you have right in the front of your mind that your future may very well involve an orange jumpsuit someplace rather than a heroic welcome back in the mother country. So that would be the second question, and I want to make sure you understand that. If you have any questions about the question, you've got a minute, and if you don't, then just get back to me in writing as to whether that's a purpose you'd like to help us pursue.
If I may, just since we have a little bit of time, address the first question. Yes, the task that Ukrainian prosecutors, our colleagues there, confront is a daunting one indeed.
Yeah, it's massive. I'm
Well
aware
over
of nothing like it in the law.
Well, but we have been at DOJ consulting with them on different platforms for building a case management system. We have a lot of experience at Justice in massive cases involving terabytes of information. And the Criminal Division's International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program, ISATAP, has actually helped the National Police of Ukraine build an electronic evidence management system, and they did that not realizing, of course.
Our time is up, but I would love it if you would send somebody who knows about that over to give us a little briefing on a bipartisan basis. I know Senator Graham and I and Senator Blumenthal would appreciate it because we've been talking a lot about this. And if you could make that person available, that would be helpful, even a Zoom call. Thank you. Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being here. And Mr. Watson, thank you for mentioning our Stop FGM Act. That is something that many of us here have worked on for a number of years, so we appreciate that. I want to change the subject just a little bit. We've talked a lot about Ukraine, but I want to move it over to China and the atrocities that are being carried out by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghurs. We've also seen an uptick in violations against the Tibetans and the Mongolians. And as I've listened to you today, and as I've thought about what we're viewing, whether it is what's happening in Russia, in Ukraine, what we're seeing in China, what we're seeing in Iran, you know, I'd like to hear from you. How do we best move forward to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for what they're doing? We're hearing there are 1 million Uyghurs that they are holding in camps. We hear that others are targets, they're harassed, they're surveilled. So, Mr. Rosenbaum, let me come first to you, and then Mr. Watson, if you'll have anything to add to that.
Thank you, Senator. Again, thank you especially for your concern regarding these horrible crimes that almost unbelievably in the 21st century are still being committed. The two countries that you mentioned, neither of those countries is at war, and yet crimes are being committed, as the Secretary of State has, in particular, has made clear publicly. And we don't have still a crimes against humanity law that would cover atrocity crimes committed outside the context of armed conflict. So I think that those situations cry out for attention, and one could, of course, expand the list to countries like North Korea and to non-state actors that control territory like ISIS, right, not covered by a war crime statute. I think that's a part of the answer, so that perpetrators know that they may face justice even across the Atlantic in the United States. Beyond that, of course, there are sanctions and other efforts on which the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the State Department, the Justice Department all collaborate.
Thank you. Mr. Watson?
Yes, Senator, I'd be pleased to note that we have a level of effort and engagement with regards to that topic. There are other HSI program divisions that are supporting inquiries as it relates to practices relating to the Uyghur population. I would note that our Center to Combat Human Trafficking is taking a lead posture with regards to the issue of forced labor. So I believe that would be an option to explore the level of effort across DHS being led by the CCHT, Center to Combat Human Trafficking, that could be of benefit.
Are they actively engaged in the cartels, monitoring the cartels and what they're doing with human trafficking at the southern border? How are they addressing that?
I thank you for that question. I would be happy to take that back for
I
a
would love to get an answer to that. When I talk to local law enforcement and what they're seeing with the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the physical, emotional, mental, sexual abuse of people that are being brought across the border, many times it is just horrifying to think that this is happening. I think also we look at what is happening in Iran, and I've had so many Tennesseans say, we see the protest in Iran, we see what they're doing to women. How could we possibly be negotiating with them on a new nuclear deal? It seems inconceivable. So I am glad to see Senator Grassley and Senator Graham's bill dealing with human rights violators. I hope that that is something the committee will choose to move forward on. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. Mr. Rosenbaum, last month, Senator Portman and I traveled to Ukraine. We met with President Zelensky and Defense Minister Reznikov for over an hour. We went to Irpin and saw the apartment buildings blown out. We went to Bucha, saw the mass grave, and it was just something I'm never going to forget. The barbarism of Vladimir Putin up front and center. I understand you've also traveled to Ukraine. Can you say a bit more about your experience there and how it's motivated your work to lead the Justice Department's War Crime Accountability Team?
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. So we have had similar experiences, though I must say I have not been to any of the scenes of atrocity crimes. But on June 21, Attorney General Garland led a team, mostly Justice Department personnel, but also Ambassador Van Skak and Sarah Langenkamp from the State Department. Also, FBI was represented, and we had Clint Williamson of the ACA group with us as well. And I should note that Ms. Langenkamp, as some of you may know, was killed in a bicycling accident in Bethesda just a few years ago, and she was really one of the heroes in supporting the people of Ukraine through these nightmarish times. It's a terrible loss for her family especially, but really for the cause of justice and humanity. It was an experience unlike anything I've ever had in nearly 4 decades of working on cases involving human rights crimes, because in all the other cases I've worked on, the criminal activity was completed. Sometimes it had been completed decades earlier, as was true for World War II Nazi crimes. But here we were in a war zone. And it was so inspiring to see the courage of our colleagues in the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General at a time when the military situation was arguably much worse than it is now. And they were determined to continue fighting for justice, but you could see on their faces the shock and the despair. As I'm sure you witnessed, one of the prosecutors was actually wearing his combat fatigues. So I will say that visit was about a week after the Attorney General asked me to take on the Ukraine task. And I greeted it with some trepidation. Is this something that I really could make a difference in? And by the time we left Ukraine, I knew that if I would do everything within my power with my colleagues at the Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section and elsewhere in the department to make a difference.
Oh, thank you. Could you just briefly answer the next questions? Can swift prosecution of war crimes that occurred early in a conflict, just based on your past experience, help to deter future crimes from being committed as the conflict continues? You're talking about that this is different because it's ongoing.
Senator, I do personally believe that. It's one of the fundamental bases of criminal prosecution is deterrence. And prosecuting as soon as possible, as soon as one responsibly can prosecute, perpetrators of crimes, we do believe has a deterrent effect.
How are the atrocities in Ukraine similar to the Nazi-era war crimes you have spent decades prosecuting? And what steps can you take today to ensure that the future prosecutions are successful?
Well, there are certainly areas of overlap, including fundamentally the invasion of a peaceful land, Ukraine, which has now suffered massive invasions twice within living memory. Rampant war crimes and crimes against humanity. So again, that has similarities to crimes that invading Nazi German forces perpetrated in Ukraine and Poland and elsewhere. From a law enforcement perspective, if I may say, there's a number of differences. One of which is that the The country that has presumably the largest quantum of evidence is Russia. And whereas in the Nazi cases, the Hitler regime was succeeded by a responsible West German government, which has provided for decades now extensive assistance in those Nazi cases. We're not expecting assistance from the Russian government anytime soon. As to what can be done, we're obviously tracking the crimes, working closely with our Ukrainian colleagues and other efforts in Europe. I was privileged to represent the Attorney General at the Ukraine Accountability Conference, ministerial conference in July. 45 nations, I've never seen anything like that, 45 nations agreed that they would work together to document the crimes, to provide the Ukrainians with the assistance that they need, and do whatever it takes, basically, to achieve accountability.
I just have one last question, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind. The world knows about Russian atrocities in Ukraine in large part because of the extensive reporting that journalists are doing every day. These journalists are exposing Vladimir Putin's brutality, combating the lies being spread at great personal risk. Many journalists have been killed by Russian forces while covering the war, including Brent Reno, an American citizen, and Fox News cameraman Pierre Zachevsky, an Irish citizen. Without getting into any specific case, can you speak to the department's efforts to investigate the killing of journalists in Ukraine?
As the Attorney General has said publicly, that is definitely an area of interest, of strong interest for the department. Those were horrible victimizations, and our hearts go out to the families, of course. When American citizens have been harmed or killed in Ukraine, there is potential jurisdiction for the United States, and I can't go further than that, except to say that we are paying close attention.
All right.
And our own investigations are vigorously pursued.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Klobuchar. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you both for the work that you're doing and your decades of service, Mr. Rosenbaum. I just kind of putting some numbers to the pictures here. I think the UN has estimated that some 6,000 civilians have been killed since the invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th. 400 of them were children. 9,000 have been injured, almost 700 of them children. And the UN also says that they believe that these numbers are probably low. I share a sentiment with Senator Blackburn on crimes against humanity and holding China accountable. I share Senator Cornyn's concerns with maybe some people crossing the border illegally. They may actually be leaving before they can get caught. But what I really am concerned about is swift action on the part of Congress. Mr. Rosenbaum, you mentioned how filling the gaps could help us prosecute cases. Mr. Watson, in response to Senator Durbin's question about the 1,700 leads, I'm kind of curious for cases that we're pursuing here. What is our conviction rate now? Once you finally bring a case, how successful are we with prosecuting these cases based on the tools you have right now?
Senator, thank you for your question. I'm pleased to report that due to the effort of our special agents in coordination with assistant U.S. attorneys as well as our principal legal advisors, we are relatively successful in presenting and achieving convictions on immigration as well as nationalization fraud, to include perjury and false statements. So it's due in part to the resilience and subject matter expertise of our special agents and support staff that we achieve these results successfully. So I can't give you a specific number in terms of a percentage, but as captured in my written testimony, we have several examples where our special agents went above and beyond in achieving successful convictions, sir.
Mr. Rosenbaum, when you alluded to filling gaps to help proceed with particularly war crimes cases, are there legislative proposals that fit that mold now that we should be moving quickly on, or do we need more feedback from you on how to exactly tune it to make your job easier and to bring more people to justice.
Thank you for that offer, Senator. We would indeed be eager to work with the Congress on legislation. We certainly endorse the idea of providing present in jurisdiction over war criminals who come here. And if one of the lessons of the post-World War II era is, in part because the United States is the most generous country in the world in accepting immigrants, I wouldn't be alive but for that. They will manage to, some of them will manage to sneak in along with the majority of upstanding immigrants. We are also interested in Title VIII remedies, and I know the ranking member and others have been exploring that through legislation. We still do not have an immigration bar for participants in persecution or for war criminals. I mean, literally, there is no Title 18 inadmissibility provision for war criminals or persecutors or for some other category of other categories of participants in grave crimes.
Mr. Chairman stepped out, but for the chairman and ranking member, I have the privilege of being the co-lead for the Senate NATO Observer Group, and I'm following Ukraine very closely. I think that Chair Durbin mentioned that this is an important moment. I think it is, and we have to think about it strategically. You've seen Putin call up 300,000 additional troops who do not want to serve. Russian people are beginning to understand the atrocities that are occurring in Ukraine. The Kremlin has recently passed laws that are a 10-year sentence for refusing to be basically a conscientious objector to the war, 10-year sentence, and a 15-year sentence if you don't obey orders on the battlefield. There is nothing more important in terms of our strategic posture going into the winter than sending a very clear message that these are war crimes and that we're going to provide every device available to prosecute anyone that we can. We have to have our NATO allies join that, because I will tell you it will have a major strategic effect on the battlefield. That requires Congress to act now. This is not a discussion we should be having 6 months from now about how we fine-tune it. Before this Congress ends, we should have a markup in this committee, we should fill the gaps, and we should send a very clear message to anyone that Putin is calling up to continue these atrocities, that they're going to be held accountable. That will save lives in Ukraine, and it's needed before we finish this Congress. Thank you.
We completely agree at the Department of Justice that this is an urgent matter, Senator. Thank you.
I want to thank Senator Tillis. I agree with you as well. Senator Blumenthal.
And I agree, and I'd like to be added to your bill. I understand you're pairing Republicans and Democrats, so I hope that another of our Republican colleagues, and more than one, will join so that additional Democrats can be included. But I appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member was absolutely correct. This cause ought to be bipartisan. As I watched the video that you showed, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't help but think of my own father, who came to this country in 1935. He was 17 years old. He came alone to escape what he saw coming. He spoke no English. He had virtually nothing more than the shirt on his back, and he knew almost no one. And this country gave him a chance to succeed, and it gave him a chance to bring over his parents and his siblings, and the rest of his family perished. And I had the same feeling of horror when Senator Graham and I visited Bucha and a number of the towns surrounding Kyiv just a couple of months ago and met with President Zelensky. And I think for any American who sees these scenes of horror, who understands what it's like to visit a town like Bucha and talk to the mayor and others there about their losses, what they've seen and heard, those women and children, their hands tied behind their backs and then shot in the head because they had the courage to venture out of their homes, sometimes in search of bread and water. In July, Senator Graham and I led a resolution to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. It was passed unanimously by the United States Senate. We have now introduced legislation that would require that it be designated a state sponsor of terrorism, and I hope it will be adopted as well, both in the Senate and the House, by the same bipartisan majority. It would tighten the sanctions, increase and heighten the consequences for Russia, but it would also permit actions to be brought in the courts of the United States against Russia and others. They would be civilian action, but I wonder if you could talk through some of the additional legal consequences to Russia and to individuals there if Russia is designated as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Thank you, Senator. I think I know that all Americans share your revulsion in the wake of the ghastly crimes that have been perpetrated by Russian forces in Ukraine and that continue to be perpetrated. As for the terrorism question, that's beyond my experience or purview at the Department of Justice. What I know of it is that it is ordinarily the Secretary of State who makes the determination whether to add a country to the list, so to speak, of state sponsors of terrorism. As far as consequences are concerned, our work at DOJ in the War Crimes Accountability Team builds on very successful efforts that have come out of the kleptocapture, the task force kleptocapture that the Attorney General announced earlier this year. Many Americans have seen the photos and videos of super yachts that have been seized from oligarchs who are facilitating Russia's invasion of unlawful and unjust invasion of.
But there's no question, sir, that it would give you additional tools. It would give you, if nothing else, the moral suasion and force that designating a country as a pariah, one of a small club, Cuba, North Korea, Syria, that are outside the group of civilized countries. Annexation, forced voting to provide for annexation, filtration camps where people in effect are detained simply because they are a specific nationality, genocide, killing people because they are simply Ukrainians. These are acts of terror, and I think would provide you with additional tools. My time has expired, but I thank you both for your excellent work and look forward to continuing to cooperate with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Of course, I hope we can add your name as a co-sponsor. We know you wish to be one on this legislation, but we're trying to keep it on a balanced approach to it. I've been told that several senators are trying to return. Is Senator Graham here? On his way. Yes. Walking over. Hope he's walking fast. Are there any other Democrats on their way? Yes, Senator. We're going to just ask people to stand down for a minute or two and see if colleagues arrive. I want to give them a chance.
If Mr. Chairman, if
Senator Blumenthal?
If
Senator, you are invited to fill the lull.
if I can get my, let me ask you, both of you, about the filtration camps, because it strikes me that they are very much like detention. I wouldn't use the word necessarily concentration camps, but where do they rank in your view in evaluating war crimes? Mr. Rosenbaum.
Again, that is a horrible situation that we are tracking closely. There is limited information, but not inconsiderable information on what is exactly transpiring there. Among the concerns is the transfer of people who go through those camps to Russia proper. And there, if they are mistreated, some would question whether war crimes law continues to apply, or whether in that instance it would be crimes against humanity laws instead, which of course in our country we don't have. And we are almost alone among, for instance, the NATO countries. I think there are only 2 NATO countries, and I'm going to include the 2 that are joining now, as having crimes against humanity laws. But just as far as I know, only 2 do not, and of course the United States is one of them. So it's another instance in which it would be helpful to have crimes against humanity, very helpful to have crimes against humanity on American law books at long last.
The chairman alluded to, and I'll just conclude because I see my colleague Senator Graham has arrived. The chairman alluded to the question he's been asked, and I have been as well, whether the law could ever reach Vladimir Putin. My answer is yes. At the very least, in my view, he could be tried and convicted in absentia. He isn't going to be in that position forever, maybe for less time than he expects. And if he refuses to submit to the jurisdiction of a valid court, the International Court of Criminal Justice, couldn't he be tried and convicted in absentia?
Again, I can't speculate on individual cases. That's not consistent with Justice Department policy. But I will say that the post-Cold War era has seen a number of heads of state brought before courts to be brought to justice in the wake of atrocity crimes.
Thank you.
I'm glad you said that, because I think there was a recent prosecution in Cambodian experience under Pol Pot, and that's decades ago, but the pursuit of justice continued, and I think we ought to make that clear. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One, thank you for having the hearing. This is a great hearing. I appreciate it. I've been working with you and Senator Blumenthal and many others to try to find a way to, there's a couple things I think we need to do. We need to continue to help the Ukraine financially. They're fighting like tigers. They're using the equipment we give them to great effect. They need financial support to keep the government open and lights on, and the world can do more, but I think it's in our interest to make sure that Ukraine has the resources to continue the fight. There's an effort to make Russia a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law. I think that could be a game changer, and hope we can move forward there. But the other lane that we're interested in is letting the Russian military know that we're watching. Do you agree, Mr. Rosenbaum, that's an important message to send?
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent question, and I certainly agree that it's extremely important that Russia knows that the free world is watching. That was one of the messages that I think was sent loudly from the Ukraine Accountability Conference in The Hague, when 45 nations together said we're watching and we're going to help achieve accountability.
Are you both, Mr. Watson, are you familiar with efforts, bipartisan efforts to change ASPA, I think is the acronym, to allow ICC investigators to come to the United States and gather evidence regarding Russian war crimes in Ukraine? Are you familiar with that?
Thank you for your question, Senator. No, I am not.
Okay. Well, we'll make you familiar. Mr. Rosenbaum, are you familiar with that?
Yes, Senator. I'm generally familiar with it. I'm certainly familiar with the American Service Members Protection Act of 2002 and the Dodd Amendment to it.
We talked with Mr. Sullivan yesterday, but a group of us. The administration was openly supportive of a change in our law. It would not subject American service members to ICC jurisdiction, but it would allow a small change in U.S. law to allow the ICC to come to the United States and access information that we have that's unique and that would be pivotal in any case they brought against Russian war criminals. I am hoping, Senator Durbin, we can deliver on that in December. And I want to have a robust lane of assistance to the ICC to start prosecutions early next year against Russian war criminals and let the Russian military know you follow Putin's orders at your own peril. When it comes to the benefit of international prosecutions in terms of deterring future misbehavior, do you think that's a reality given the past?
Well, I think, Senator, a lot of people thought that after Nuremberg, we would not see large-scale atrocity crimes being committed ever again. And with the benefit of hindsight, obviously, that turned out to be incorrect. Some of us thought that with the end of the Cold War that we wouldn't see perpetration of large-scale atrocity crimes. We were wrong about that as well.
So let's just build on that. There will be an effort in the Congress to assist Ukraine with the weapons and the economic support they need to continue the fight. There will be an effort in the Congress to make Russia state-sponsored terrorism, making it in the nation of Category 5 other nations like North Korea and Iran. And I think there's going to be an effort in Congress to open up evidentiary lanes to the ICC so that prosecutions become more real. If we can pull this off, to my colleagues, by the end of this year, then 2023 could be a consequential year. If the Russians see and the Ukrainians see a flow of economic and military assistance, a further isolation of Russia by making them a state-sponsored terrorism, and a viable lane of prosecution for the war crimes they're committing right before our eyes, I think it can turn the tide of battle in 2023. We as Congress can have a great effect on the outcome of this war. I want to thank all of my colleagues, Senator Durbin and Blumenthal and others, Coons, all of you, for trying to get to that day. If Putin uses a nuclear weapon, if he follows through on his threat in Ukraine, I would consider that an attack on NATO writ large. The radiation would affect all of Europe, not just Ukraine. So we're being blackmailed by one of the biggest thugs of the 21st century. Now's the time to stand up to that blackmail. Very quickly, Jake Sullivan gave the right answer when he said there would be catastrophic consequences if Russia used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. He's right, and I hope NATO will reinforce that message, and I hope the Congress will reinforce the message. If there is a nuclear explosion in Ukraine directed by Putin, that would be an attack on NATO itself, and all hell would come to bear on Putin. If we don't send that message, we're making a huge mistake to him and other thugs like him. Thank you.
I would also add, Senator Graham, in the context of your hope and my shared hope, that we have to make it clear that the results of the election will not change our determination on a bipartisan basis.
Not one bit.
Thank you. Senator Coons?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley, for both holding this hearing and for your leadership in this legislation. And to Mr. Rosenbaum, Mr. Watson, thank you for your service, and thank you for the compelling, the graphic, the difficult testimony that you've delivered today. We all know from press accounts and from what we've seen and heard from Ukrainian witnesses that Russian troops have been committing unspeakable atrocities at a big scale across Ukraine, torturing and murdering civilians. But we have to take action to make sure that our global leadership role as a defender of human rights continues to be a key part of our foreign policy. I'm the co-chair with Senator Tillis of North Carolina of the Senate Human Rights Caucus, and we often stand together to condemn perpetrators of crimes against humanity and work to get the resources needed to deliver on our moral obligation to stand for human rights around the globe. I've recently traveled within the last year to countries like Rwanda, that was the site of a horrific genocide well after the Shoah in Europe, and a reminder that genocide can continue to happen around the world. And I've been recently to Ethiopia and to Sudan to hear from and meet with victims of crimes committed by all parties to the ongoing conflict in Tigray. And I think that continuing to ensure that there is real accountability is a key step for repairing communities harmed in these ways. So if I might, Mr. Rosenbaum, first, thank you for being here today and for the ways in which you and your team at the Department of Justice help ensure that standard set following the Nuremberg trials, and in terms of chasing to the ends of the earth those who'd committed those unique, sadly not unique, those horrifying atrocities of the Second World War were pursued. I'm glad to join as a co-sponsor of the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act because it shows our commitment to deterring those atrocities. And we currently lack the legal tools to prosecute bad actors in our grasp here in the United States. Should this become law, what are the additional resources that DOJ's War Crimes Accountability Team needs?
Thank you, Senator, for those generous words and for the commitment that you and other senators on both sides of the aisle are showing in support of efforts to strengthen protections for human rights and to including the accountability efforts in the wake of human rights violations. One of the ways that we pursue accountability is by having the statutory tools in our country that are needed by both of our agencies to pursue accountability. Right now, a perpetrator from Bucha could come to the United States and we wouldn't be able to prosecute him or her for war crimes. That's just not acceptable, I would submit. As far as resources are concerned, well, it's always the case that with more resources, you can do more. We at Justice are in a sort of unusual situation in criminal assistance matters, criminal law enforcement assistance matters, in that our funding, much of it comes from the State Department for our ISATAP team and our OPDAT team. And we're grateful for those taxpayer resources that are made available, but it is unusual and perhaps not the most efficient way of proceeding for the Justice Department, which is a law enforcement entity, to have to go to a non-law enforcement entity and justify what we're doing.
If I could, I have just a minute left. As the senator who chairs the committee that funds the State Department, that's partly why I was asking you, was that it comes through my subcommittee. What are the most critical resources we need to provide you with to actually implement this bill to become law?
We could use more prosecutors, more historians, case analysts for this work, resources to help the Ukrainians in what they're doing. That's time intensive and personnel intensive, that type of thing.
And what's the benefit in terms of deterrence for future crimes against humanity that would result from our actually prosecuting and imposing criminal sanctions on those who come to the United States who've committed war crimes?
Well, I think it would send a powerful message that as compared to the World War II situation, in which we waited until 1979 to finally, at Congress's insistence, create a serious effort to root out these people and bring them to justice, I would say after a fashion, that now we are moving immediately. And I think that
Mr. Watson, if I might, just briefly, the same question to you for DHS. For Homeland Security investigations, what are the additional resources we should be trying to provide? And what impact do you see in terms of deterrence for other crimes against humanity?
Thank you, Senator. We are greatly appreciative of the appropriated resources we as ICE receive in furtherance of the Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center. The over $5 million that we receive is extremely helpful in paying salaries as well as facilitating training and also travel for our special agents, regional support teams in conducting investigations and inquiries in furtherance to cases development, prosecution, or administrative removal. So thank you in advance for those appropriated funds that we have received. I do believe that to continue that momentum, there is an enduring requirement as it relates to training and outreach. As our workforce matures, we are oftentimes running advanced training scenarios at least twice per fiscal year. And in doing so, we work to identify not only new special agents, but also associate legal advisors and also historians. So as we work to transition and train our workforce to include new personnel to support these investigations, those appropriations are critical, not only in ensuring that we have a properly trained and ready and responsive workforce, but that we continue to perfect our criminal investigations, administrative proceedings, and/or removals. So it would be helpful to continue that level of effort in accordance with our interagency requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Rosenbaum. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership to strengthen U.S. law to hold war criminals accountable. Thank you, Mr. Rosenbaum, Mr. Watson, for your service. Mr. Rosenbaum, would appreciate your analysis, your personal analysis, if you're willing, of how the Alien Tort Statute is situated with respect to non-U.S. persons who may wish to bring suit in U.S. court against those who have committed war crimes abroad. The Supreme Court has narrowed the applicability of the Alien Tort Statute. Nevertheless, what's your view of whether it still affords any scope for such litigation?
With apologies, I have to confess that's beyond my experience at Justice, and so I'm not well positioned to address that. Those are civil remedies, and I've just not had experience with them. But I'm sure that our Office of Legislative Affairs would be pleased to get back with your staff if you wish.
Yeah, I'll engage with your colleagues at the department about that and suggest, Mr. Chairman, it's something we should think about as we consider this legislation. This is also beyond your specific purview, but I think that both of you will be able to offer an informed perspective on this, particularly because there is interagency collaboration to address these issues. So you will work, for example, from time to time, I presume, with colleagues at Treasury. How have you experienced the U.S. sanctions regime to afford authorities, for example, to target through Magnitsky or other statutes war criminals? And do you believe there's an opportunity to strengthen the underlying statutes? We can start with you, Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. We've had great success by way of our global Magnitsky investigative support team. I would like to highlight our investigation as it relates to the Bangladeshi Rapid Action Battalion, which was successfully designated pursuant to Executive Order 13-1818. So we did have success there pursuant to information and intelligence, which substantiated in excess of 600 extrajudicial killings that were committed by the Rapid Action Battalion. So there is a good level of effort in coordination between the Department of State, Justice, and Treasury. So I'd like to highlight that as an example of a recent success that was accomplished across those three departments. And at the same time, I do think and believe that there is an opportunity for more in that arena and area. And I think as we continue to focus on new opportunities to include interagency collaboration at the center, that we can present opportunities that could be successful in this theater as well, too.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Mr. Rosenbaum, you have anything to add?
I would just echo what Assistant Director Watson has said. There is excellent coordination among the pertinent agencies, as a result of which I think it's fair to say the United States is among the leaders in the world in identifying, calling out, and sanctioning human rights violators, but as always, more can be done.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenbaum, I'm not sure, I confess, to what extent you've had the chance to dig in on the specific text that Senator Durbin has put forward. Are you familiar with the precise outlines of what he's suggesting in terms of revisions to the law?
If you're speaking of the bill that's been introduced, the Justice for Victims of War Crimes, certainly we've looked at it. And
so let me ask you this question, if I might. As I understand the legislation, it would expand the capacity of DOJ to prosecute persons who are in the United States for offenses committed abroad. What would be the issues that the department might consider or that Congress should consider when we're thinking about extradition in this context? So persons who are not in the United States but could be brought here for the purpose of prosecution when they've committed atrocities overseas.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, of course. The Justice Manual, which guides us as prosecutors, requires us to consider in making prosecutorial recommendations and decisions the possibility of prosecution in other venues, even other countries. And extradition practice is an important part of what the Justice Department does. Our Office of International Affairs and Criminal Division coordinates that for the entire Department of Justice. We have had cases where, one case in particular comes to mind, where we indicted someone for torture, and then it turned out that Bosnia and Herzegovina wanted to try him there, and in effect, we stopped our case and extradited him to Bosnia and Herzegovina so that he could be judged in the community where the offenses occurred. And also, that would not require U.S. taxpayers to foot the bill.
And how about in the other direction? Would there be circumstances authorized under Senator Durbin's proposal or under existing law whereby the U.S. could pursue the extradition of those located overseas into the United States for purpose of prosecution here?
Of course, people are extradited in any number of scenarios.
Or war crimes prosecutions under this statute?
I don't know that the bill, as I've seen it, would enhance that authority. Where we really are lacking that ability is under the torture statute. So if someone, God forbid, tortures an American under color of law outside the context of armed conflict, a U.S. citizen, a U.S. service member grabbed off the street, God forbid, or a U.S. official, we can't indict that person because the offender isn't present in the United States and is not a U.S. citizen. And if we can't charge them, we can't seek their extradition. So that's the gaping hole there.
It's worth looking at that. Let me, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, and I asked Senator Padilla if he was okay with it, if you wouldn't mind, just because it's so important. Is that all right, Mr. Chairman?
With Senator Padilla's permission, of course.
Okay. We all rely upon Senator Padilla's permission on the judiciary. There's no reason that evidence collected by the Congress in the course of our investigative and oversight work could not be submitted to the department for purposes of consideration of criminal prosecution related to war crimes, correct?
I thank you in advance for that evidence. Yes, Senator.
Okay. And then my final question, what limitations would there be on the use of U.S. intelligence and evidence that is secured by the U.S. intelligence community, potentially, for example, sensitive signals intelligence, for the purposes of making war crimes prosecutions or determinations about criminal referrals in other jurisdictions?
Again, another excellent question. There are circumstances in which the U.S. intelligence community can make information, even evidence available that assists prosecutors. There are elaborate procedures for that. There are we have close contacts with our colleagues in the IC. I can't go into specifics, of course, but it certainly can.
No, of course, you can't go into specifics on sources and methods, but I do want us, and I can discuss with the Chairman as well, to think about whether or not there are impediments to your using information that's available to the U.S. government through sensitive collection for purposes of holding war criminals accountable. We can sit down in a classified session if you want to discuss it in more detail.
If I may, one impediment that we have is in the War Crimes Act, 18 U.S.C. 2441, as it currently stands, our prosecutors are required, in order to bring a war crimes case, to establish whether whether the armed conflict was an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. And one of the complications there is the information that we need to make that showing can be classified. It can also involve delicate questions of foreign affairs, but We favor, therefore, eliminating the distinction between international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict, which will also enable us to prosecute the full array of egregious war crimes across the board, irrespective of whether they were committed by ISIS in a non-international armed conflict or by Russia in an international armed conflict.
Thank you, Mr. And Senator Padilla is clearing his throat, so I better wrap up. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence as well.
Thanks, Senator Ossoff. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know it's been a lengthy and substantive hearing. Appreciate the participation of both of our witnesses. And I'll apologize in advance for jumping into some weeds here. The questions that remain to be asked, I believe, for today do get technical and specific. And I'll start with Mr. Watson. In your testimony, you mentioned that crimes of genocide and other war crimes merely carry the generic 5-year statute of limitations when the violations do not result in death. You also stated that the crime of torture carries an 8-year statute of limitation if the acts did not result in death or serious bodily injury or the foreseeable risk of such. So take this as an open-ended question. Do you believe the statute of limitations changes proposed in the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act are a step in the right direction? And can you just reference any data or experience in sort of supporting the suggestions for the changes?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, is my response that I believe the changes to the extension of statute of limitations would be helpful to the law enforcement partners at the Human Rights Violators War Crimes Center. And I would just highlight in support of that assessment our investigation of a Rwandan national, Beatrice Munyenyezi, who was implicated in genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And she, by way of fraud, came to the United States in 1998, and through up to 9 trips by HSI Boston special agents to Rwanda to collect information of evidentiary purpose for criminal prosecution, which wasn't presented until in or about 2000, I want to say 2010, I believe it was. But nevertheless, she obtained U.S. citizenship in 2003, right? So when we look at the context of 1994, when the Tutsi and the Hutus were engaged in those activities, those heinous crimes against humanity and genocide, clearly with the statute being what it is, there was more time, right, in excess of 10 years before our special agents and regional support team members, historians were able to work with our international partners to obtain the relevant evidence to present a viable criminal prosecution. And even so, we only presented fraud by way of naturalization and potentially perjury as 2 substantive charges that were ultimately perfected where Munyenyezi was convicted. So I would say by way of that situation and that investigation, where she was sentenced to 10 years, ultimately served about just over 7, and was subsequently deported to Rwanda and is currently on trial right now for crimes of genocide, that specific instance would apply.
That's an excellent example. So safe to say that the 5-year and 8-year statutes that I referenced serve as a disincentive for longer-term investigation, let alone identification or prosecution?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Now coming back to Mr. Rosenbaum, you acknowledged in your testimony that our current body of substantive human rights law is limited by significant jurisdictional, temporal, and evidentiary limitations. While the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act would allow the Department of Justice to prosecute alleged war crimes who are present in the United States, the requirement of establishing specific intent to prove alleged offenders have committed genocide and torture presents an often insurmountable evidentiary bar. Can you explain how our current jurisdictional and evidentiary limitations would affect potential prosecutions of Russian nationals present in the United States for crimes committed in Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. because we don't have so-called present in jurisdiction, in general, Russian war criminals who might come here would not be prosecutable criminally for the underlying war crimes. And the Justice Department believes strongly that should be corrected. I would say also, going back to the discussion that you had, or the question you posed to my colleague, Assistant Director Watson, statutes of limitations definitely should be expanded as we see it, not only for substantive offenses, but also for the immigration and naturalization fraud criminal prosecutions that are often our only recourse in human rights violator cases. Those are 5 years for visa fraud and 10 years for naturalization fraud. As you probably know, it's often decades before the government even learns about the underlying human rights crimes, and by then the statute of limitations has run. That was our experience in all of the World War II Nazi cases, for instance.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll have other questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I want to follow up with Mr. Watson. In your testimony, you talked about one prosecution, Mohammed Jabbateh, and I thought it was interesting that even though there are limitations, and we've discussed them this morning, that in that case, Mr. Jabbateh was sentenced to 30 years in prison for immigration fraud and perjury. So the 5-year limit on sentencing you mentioned earlier did not apply in that case. They found another statute to charge him under?
So for that investigation, it was visa fraud at Title 18 United States Code Section 1546, and also perjury, Title 18 United States Code Section 1621. So those were the two statutes that were used to convict. But what's interesting to note about Mohammed Jabbateh is that with his activities as it relates to ULIMO, which was a Liberian Truth organization and entity that he participated therein, those crimes against humanity were quite severe in terms of what was alleged, in terms of killings, in terms of torture, and also in terms of sexual exploitation, but also desecration of corpses, consumption of human remains. By far, his activities were quite egregious to where it would shock the conscience. And I think when that information was introduced, there were, I would submit, aggravating factors to suggest the opportunity to sentence at that level in accordance with a pre-sentencing investigation. And
Can I zero in on that and ask you, when it came to visa fraud, what was the question that he lied to?
Thank you for that question. I will have to take that back and get you a response on that, sir.
Okay. All right. I think the gravity of the situation, I think we've had a good hearing and exploring it, just the beginning. I appreciate the witnesses and their testimony. Forgive me as a son of Illinois for quoting a man from Illinois who was president in the 19th century. 1862, Lincoln said, speaking of our obligation to abolish slavery, we, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. Today, it is within our power and our responsibility on this committee to ensure that this country can never be used as a safe haven by perpetrators of atrocities. It is clear that we have much work to do to fulfill the promise of Nuremberg. I hope you noted the bipartisanship that was on display today. It's real. There have been many meetings to evidence that fact. And I'm glad my colleagues on both sides of the aisle share my opinion about the role of this committee and this Congress, particularly as it relates to the situation in Ukraine. And with that, the Senate Judiciary Committee will stand adjourned.